Thank you everyone so much for coming to Yampa Valley Sustainability Council's Fall Intern Closeout Presentation Ceremony. My name is Dakota Dolan. I'm the Internship Program Manager as well as the Forest Resilience Projects Manager with YVSC. I'm so excited to be sharing the wonderful work of Mackenzie and Sammy today. If you're unfamiliar with the program, it's a 12-week professional experience for local students and recent graduates to give them direct exposure to a professional experience with YVSC, a local nonprofit in sustainability. Their term starts with being paired with the staff mentor, and from there, together, the intern and the staff member create a project that both meets the needs of the organization, as well as fulfilling a desire of that intern's career path. All of the internship projects are related to Routt County sustainability initiatives and environmental projects that we are all currently working on at YVSC. And I would love to introduce our Executive Director, Michelle Stewart, to say a few words before we begin.
Hello, everyone. Thank you, Cody, for such a wonderful overview of the program, and welcome. It's so exciting. This is one of our 3 favorite days in the year, which is when we get to see the fabulous work of our interns. Our internship program is such an important part of our work as an organization. We feel very strongly that empowering our next leaders to go on and do even better work than we can do today is essential to creating the future that we need. And so I really want to say, Sammy and Kenzie, amazing work over this past term. It is such a pleasure to have Dakota be leading the program. She's done an exceptional job working as a primary mentor, and then they've worked closely with staff as well as directors. So I just want to say thank you for coming and making this a celebration that it is today. We always learn new things from them, and so our interns bring in their own innovation, their insights, and their commitment to the issues. And then we as staff really try to impart what it is to be part of the daily work. And so I just want to say that the projects themselves are substantive and important, but also the legacy that they create is one that we continue to celebrate moving forward, and it's making real impact at a time that we need it. So thank you so much for coming. It's really a pleasure to have a packed room in this beautiful space. And so I will turn it over to Cody to cue up the presentations.
Great. Now that everyone's back in their seats, we'll move on to Sammy Wyman's presentation on Climate Action Plan communication.
Hi, I'm Sammy. I think I've met a lot of you, but not all of you. So I will introduce myself more on the next slide. But for now, I was the YVSC Climate Action Plan intern. And so I did my project on how the CAP can further engage our community. Maybe. What is funny? Let's see, I put it on this side, but it needs to be on there. There we go. Okay, a little bit more about me before I start talking about my presentation. I just graduated from Vanderbilt University with a bachelor's degree in environmental sociology and minors in data science and Spanish. I am hoping to pursue a doctoral degree in sociology. So I'm applying right now. My applications are due tomorrow. So pretty exciting. But when I was at Vanderbilt, I wrote a thesis on the association between political estrangement and opposition to Colorado wolf reintroduction. And so my interests lie in how collective identity informs conservative Americans' perceptions of environmental initiatives, specifically pertaining to energy infrastructure. When I'm not studying or applying to grad school or doing all of these things, I love to ski and ride my horse and hang out with my parents. It's in Denver. It's really my parents. So my staff mentors were Michelle Stewart, our executive director here at YVSC, and Tim Sullivan, Resilient Land and Water Director. So a little background about my project before I dive in. YVSC acts as the Climate Action Plan coordinator for Routt County. And so Climate Action Plan is a way to identify threats that are climate related that impact our community or our region, and then create a set of overarching goals in order to both adapt to these threats and mitigate climate change. But one of the main challenges with climate action plans is engaging the community, educating the community, and gaining community support for these initiatives. And so that's where my project comes in. my project objectives were to research how can we collect information on barriers in our community to climate action, and then how can we use effective climate communication to motivate people to take climate action. And then from this research, I wanted to create a proposal that would go to the Climate Action Plan Collaborative on how they can, learn more about our community's perceptions of our climate action plan. So in order to attain these objectives, this is live evidence of me. Not as cute as Mackenzie out in the field, but so to obtain these objectives, I first wrote a literature review of around 30 to 40 sources. And I had 5 different sections of my literature review. The first one was methods in general of how to collect public opinion. So looking at what are the strengths of focus groups, interviews, and surveys. And then moving on to climate opinion in general, looking at, what demographics really impact how people perceive climate change and climate action. And then what are some effective techniques for climate communication? And what are some of the most common barriers to climate action? What prevents people from acting to mitigate or adapt to climate change? And then what are some techniques that we can use to help people to become motivated and inspire them to act against climate change? And so this was a formal literature review. And then from this literature review and the findings of this literature review, and then conversations with people from other CAPs, like in Summit County and Pitkin County, I created a formal recommendation document. So first, I'm going to talk about some of the main findings from my literature review. And one opener of my literature review was talking about the global warming 6 audiences. And this comes from a study from George Mason University and Yale University. And they developed 4 short questions that categorize people into 6 climate change audiences. And so these 6 audiences are the alarmed, concerned, cautious, disengaged, doubtful, and dismissive. So these audiences can be really helpful to understand, how our community perceives climate change, and then how can we communicate climate change effectively to each of these audiences. But it's also really important to understand where our opinions on climate change come from, because often climate change public opinion research is done in somewhat of a vacuum, not looking at what makes us form these perceptions and how our community's perceptions in general formed due to different factors. And so some of these factors are demographic, like age, race, and gender. Some are value-based, values, political ideology, culture, and then some are experience-based. What have our experiences with extreme weather been, or what's our occupation? So I won't go into all my findings on each of these categories, but there were some really interesting ones. And one that I want to point out is race is a really interesting factor of climate change public opinion. And there's a lot of stereotypes around how race impacts public opinion on climate change. One of them being, due to the Maslow's hierarchy of needs, or, how we think about our most immediate needs being the most important to us. There's a stereotype that white Americans care more about climate change and environmentalism than either Black Americans or Hispanic Americans. And this is actually not the case. Research indicates that people of Hispanic descent within our communities and within America at large actually value environmentalism more than white Americans, and Black Americans value environmentalism just the same as white Americans. So that was one of the interesting findings from my literature review. So now looking at, as we understand why people believe what they believe about climate change, how do we effectively communicate climate change based on these demographic understandings? And the first way to look at climate communication is through psychology and the mental model. Our mental model acts as a filter, and it's a filter within our brain of how we take in information, what information gets through this filter, and how the filter kind of alters that information. And so if we can understand people's mental models, we can understand how to target information. So one of the main ways to target information to get through a mental model is to directly address misconceptions. If you know that a certain community or an audience has a misconception about climate change, giving direct new information to fill that gap. Also, issue framing. Talking to people about what they care about is so important. So, for example, if you're talking to a particularly religious community, maybe bringing up, what Pope Francis says about climate change, meeting people where they are. What you care about is not necessarily what other people care about. And then avoiding emotional statements. It's really easy in our current political climate to use fear as a tactic to make people, believe in what we want to believe in. But this can actually trigger the mental model, and we tend to shut down, and our filter gets more rigid when people bring up emotional topics. So if we can really remain positive and remind people that there's still time to act against climate change and we can curb global warming impacts, this tends to be the most effective measure for communicating climate change. People want to know what they're doing is going to matter. And then the importance of trusted messengers. There's a lot of research right now talking about trusted messengers and tapping into trusted networks. And unfortunately, as YVSC, we're not going to be everyone's trusted source of information. And so thinking about, how can we partner with different community organizations that are tapped into different networks than we are, and how can that help us really get through people's mental models and communicate climate change information. Then, thinking about climate opinion and our opinions on climate change is different than how we act against climate change. So there's a huge dissonance between believing that climate change is happening, knowing that it's from anthropogenic causes, and then actually taking actions to mitigate climate change in your everyday life. There's a lot of people that believe in the first one, but don't necessarily act on the second. And so there are individual, social, and psychological barriers to climate change action. There are 4 main psychological barriers. The first one being the governance distrust interpretation. So American and public trust in the government has been declining since the 1960s. Most Americans no longer believe that the government has their best interest in mind. So it's really difficult to convince people to vote for initiatives that give more government oversight when we are having a hard time believing that our government is making right decisions for us. The next is the managerial fix interpretation, which is a belief that technology will save us. Thinking that there's a market-based solution, Elon Musk is going to come up with the next great decarbonization rocket or some sort, and that this will save us. So I don't need to act against climate change in my own personal life because it'll be a market-based solution. Then there's the tragedy of commons, which is where we act in our own rational self-interest. But as we all do this as a community, we act irrationally by depleting resources. Lastly, there's the comfort interpretation, and a lot of research says that this is actually the most impactful. And it's not wanting to sacrifice the luxuries of your personal lifestyle today to benefit the lifestyles of people, in the future. So looking at some more social and individual barriers to climate change action, and many of these are tied to those psychological barriers. We have NIMBY, or not in my backyard, believing in climate change initiatives in general, like a wind farm, but when they say, they want to put it a few acres away, no longer being in support of that initiative. The free rider effect is really serious at both the local and national level. So thinking about, I don't want America to make economic sacrifices to mitigate climate change when there's other countries out there that are not going to do that, but they're still going to benefit from our sacrifices because this is a global phenomenon. And then social norms. There can be real social consequences in certain communities for taking environmental action because it is unfortunately looked at as, a bit of a liberal virtue signal these days. But hopefully we can come up with some strategies to change this social norm around environmentalism. Efficacy. We talked about this earlier, but if you don't believe that your actions are making a difference, then it's really hard to get motivated climate action. And this belief was systematically launched by the fossil fuel industries in the early 2000s and telling people that, actually, if you act against climate change or if you decarbonize in the long run, your individual action is not going to make a systemic difference. And this isn't true. We still have time to act and curb some of those threats. So really making sure we're educating people on that. And then cost concerns. A lot of environmental choices are more costly, and that's a concern for many of Americans. Okay, so now we know why people are not taking climate action, but how do we motivate people and inspire our community members to take climate action? So research indicates that we need to focus on specific initiatives. When we just tell people to be environmental or take climate action, this can be super overwhelming. How do we approach this issue? And so, specifically targeting one action at a time. And then promoting efficacy, which we just talked about, making people know that what they do matters. Marketing green technology as a market-based solution. So, just because you don't have to be egalitarian to adopt climate technology, thinking about it as an investment in your future and really, having economic incentives is important. And then sharing information in a group setting. Research indicates that if we talk about these climate solutions and actions to climate change in a group, people feel that it is a social dilemma and it's something that we can work on together and doesn't have to feel like such an isolated, overwhelming problem. And then providing immediate feedback. This is easier said than done. For example, in France, there's smart meters where you have to have a smart meter in your house, and this tells you how much energy you use in a day, and it gives direct feedback. This is going to be hard to launch something like this in our current political climate or just with our government. But if we can come up with ways where people can even opt in to ways that we tell them how much energy they're using or how environmental they're being, this can be a great way to incentivize them to make lifestyle changes. And then, like we talked about earlier, really tapping into those trusted networks and partnering with people who are trusted in different communities than us to motivate climate action. And then creating social incentives. If you are within a space that really values environmentalism, making sure that you are potentially publishing the names of people who have made, large leaps and bounds in their own sustainable lifestyles. And this can help put pressure on other people to do the same. Okay, so this is all my literature review. Now moving forward, I took this information and then conversations I had with Tim and Michelle and women from Pitkin County and Summit County to create a formal recommendation of how I think our Climate Action Plan Collaborative can collect information on how our community perceives the climate action plan and then barriers to climate action in our community more generally. And so I decided from my research that focus groups would be the best way to do this. Focus groups are really good for collecting a breadth and depth of information, specifically mini focus groups of 4 to 6 people. These tend to be more manageable and we can get into more depth of discussion rather than just hearing everybody's individual opinions. But focus groups are also awesome because you can see how people connect and how collective identity is formed. So, who disagrees with who, kind of rules the social norm of the group. It's all super informative for these real, society situations. So I think that the focus group should be made up of people within our community who are not typically heard on environmental issues. And this can help to both, motivate people, and if they feel like their ideas and thoughts are being heard, it can really help people buy into certain programs. And so I came up with 7 different demographics. So mini focus groups of the Hispanic community, ranchers, youth, working class, parents of young families, Republicans, and then as a way to, understand Republican ideals, a group of Democrats, active Democrats and So the questions for these focus groups, I came up with the help of Tim and Michelle. We had some awesome brainstorm sessions, and we came up with 4 main categories for the questions for the focus groups. The first being knowledge-based questions. What do you know about the CAP? What do you know about climate change threats in our valley? And then CAP-related questions, talking about one specific initiative, and then talking about, would you support this initiative? Would the people in your community support this? What are the challenges you see to this? Really, understanding where people are coming from and focusing on initiatives that are the most impactful for decarbonization and that will require public support to pass. And trust. Who do you trust to, communicate climate information? Where do you trust to get your information in our community? And then individual action. What have you done to take climate action? What are some of the barriers to taking climate action within your own life? After these focus groups, I propose that the mediator give out a short survey where we just collect demographic information. And then also the 6 Americas survey, the 4 questions, so we can know, what kind of audience were we dealing with within that focus group? Were people, mainly dismissive of climate change when they entered the room? Or were they, more part of this alarmed audience? We also talked about, Tim, Michelle, and I talked about that focus groups can act as a platform for education too. We can use it as an opportunity for the mediator to also give information on efficacy and how there's still time to act, and then information on the CAP so that these people within the focus groups can go back to their communities and be like, wow, I learned a lot about the CAP. Actually, maybe my preconceptions were correct. And then partnering with trusted networks to recruit participants. Vail did a phenomenal job of really partnering with community organizations that are trusted within the Hispanic community in Vail. And so they got some really awesome information for their climate equity plan by partnering with organizations like their equivalent would be Lift Up. And so thinking about what community partners are trusted within different networks. And also the importance of trusted spaces. Nathan and I talked about this yesterday about, meeting people where they are. So not having these focus groups at our office, but maybe having them at Lift Up or at Marsha Doggenbaugh's house or places where they feel most comfortable. So what are my key takeaways from this presentation? Issue framing is really important, talking to people about what they care about. The significance of positive messaging. The power of the trusted messenger. There are many psychological barriers to climate action, but there are techniques that have been found to surpass these. And then it's really important to understand where people get their public opinions and looking at how demographics and experience impact those. Personal takeaways. What are my personal takeaways? I've learned many things from our visiting speakers. For example, how city council runs. I think that was super interesting. And then how to give a good presentation. More research needs to be done on motivating climate action and how we do this. There's a lot of research that's very theoretical, but there's not a lot of tested research that has tried specific initiatives and then given feedback on these initiatives. So much more research needs to be done in this field. And then the importance of relying upon sources who have already faced similar challenges. I gained a lot from the conversations I had with other people in different counties who've already tried to do similar things. And then the power of the group brainstorm session. I think Tim, Michelle, and I came up with some awesome questions together. My acknowledgements. Okay, so I would like to acknowledge Dakota Dolan for putting on a wonderful intern cohort. We had a small group of us, but we had a lot of fun together. So that's also thanks to Mackenzie, who was a shining light of positivity. And I love your enthusiasm, and it's very inspiring. And I can't wait to work together at Primrose. Yes. So yeah, come eat at Primrose because we'll be there. We'll go for happy hour. Don't pay the rent. Also, Jess Hoover who was from High Country Conservation, Tessa Schreiner from the city of Aspen, and Tina Evans from Colorado Mountain College. We had a really fascinating conversation that helped inform my project as well. Is there any questions? Yes.
In your limited research, you found any studies that look at people if by getting people to make small changes, for example, maybe start recycling or start eating online instead of getting paper, that those small changes will result in or likely result in larger changes?
That's a great question. I did not see any studies on that. And that's the kind of research that I think is lacking, is that like super tangible research on like the direct feedback of different changes. So I didn't see anything on that, but that's a great question. Yes, Mom.
Great.
Yeah, she's like, tip tapping, you're tip tapping.
I was thinking about being in the South, just going to school in the South
Mhm.
and using different vocabulary and the messaging.
Yeah.
You kind of talked about that, but.
No, I think that's like an even greater point that like I went to school in the West initially, and then I transferred to Vanderbilt, which was the Southern school, obviously, and Macy's even farther south, and how it's all the same ideas of like climate change information, but how it's marketed very differently, and how it can be, tagged as like a sustainability major or an environmental major, because that's where the funding, it's easier to get funding for those programs if you're not saying climate change, but then you're teaching kids the very same things. And I think that's a great way to look at, value framing. In some ways, it's important to educate, and then in some ways you have to just strike a balance between education and then also, if the same goals are getting done, maybe it's just talking about it in different ways. So I think it's a great point. Yes, Michelle.
Great presentation, very interesting. It was such a pleasure working with you throughout the term of the project. Just curious, I think some of the things that we talked about was thinking about, the different, so you did a nice job breaking out the different publics that we have here.
Yeah.
And something that we've talked about a lot of as an organization is ways to really empower and engage, our younger demographic. And so can you tell us a little bit about what you learned or what you find to be insightful as we think about, developing opportunities to both connect with and then activate, that younger population. And then of interest too, we even talked about what is, what do we consider young with our younger population? Is it 15 to even 30 or is it 15 to 30? So would love to hear, your insights there for us to.
Yeah. Well, I think defining young depends definitely on what you're talking about. So for the context of this, I decided to say 18 to 32 because we need people who can vote and who can, make their own lifestyle changes. If you're living in your parents' house, you might not have the opportunity to really, make a lot of those changes. So I think a lot of the research is done on how, if you can get young people into those environmental classes, that makes a huge difference moving forward. So if you can get them in high school and college, there's a big push to have a required curriculum for environmentalism, even if it's just like one class on, theology and the environment. It can make a difference moving forward in the careers that we choose. So I think there's a lot of potential there. But then pertaining to the CAP, I think the more that we can, I would say the working public, the young people here are part of the working public. And I think predominantly they're in the service industry, and there is no environmental goals within the service industry, at least like within the restaurants that I've worked at and the shops that I've worked in. So if we can use the Colorado Green Business Network or just the CAP, I know that there's now going to be like, recycling is going to be mandated for the restaurants and stuff like that. But if we can just even have like some smaller goals or people going in and talking to those businesses, I think that would be huge, because that is where the young people are here, and it's not talked about at all. Like I was kind of shocked when I entered Primrose, and there not a single bottle gets recycled, no food gets composted, none of the sustainability stuff is talked about, which is understood. They're trying to make money, it's not their goal. But I do think you become part of that community and that environment, and it's never talked about in your place of work, and then it's never talked about amongst your friends, and then it's just, it doesn't ever, penetrate your mental model. Yes, Tim.
Ask you this question during our discussion. But do you see any lessons learned from research you did for your thesis on Wolford introduction and talking to rural audience?
Yeah. Yes, I think there is large crossover there. I think I did a lot of research for my thesis. My literature review is super focused about like rural environmentalism and a lot of the, how we talk about it differently as like stewardship or, caring about the land. And so I think the big disconnect in rural environmentalism is that it's actually been found that rural people who live in rural scenarios or do, more rural occupations like ranching, for example, actually value environmentalism more, but they're not willing to vote for government intervention. And so that's where the disconnect comes from. And that's where the CAP comes in. So I think it's going to be that's why it's going to be so difficult, is because it's not necessarily that we need to, teach people to value environmentalism. It's to convince people that you should vote for our government to intervene or actually put these systems into place. And that is another place where they need more research. I think there's a lot of research now understanding that, because I think there was kind of a stereotype of, our rural community members don't care about the environment. And now we've built an understanding that that's actually the opposite of true. And now we're going to have to do a lot of research on, okay, how do we begin to make people feel empowered and trust in our government enough to vote for these things? I guess Connor.
You alluded to cost being a major barrier for like climate action.
Yeah.
What do you say to someone that wants to recycle or own an EV but simply can't afford it? And how do we kind of come down from this middle to upper middle class that are able to afford, stuff that obviously would benefit the environment themselves? And how do we kind of get from this upper middle class to everyone can afford to do that?
Yeah, I think a lot of times, it happens, because of technology. We're such a technology focused country that a lot of times we see environmentalism as having that newest technological model, whether it's like a Tesla or, the best fridge that is Star Energy. But I think if we can talk about also just, volunteering is huge. If we can support the people who have the funding to go make some of these efforts, that's your time is valuable, but if we can all give back within that way, I think that's a great way to motivate young people. And then also, I think there's something to be said for, even if you're not in a place to have that as one of your top priorities, if we can, keep you engaged from when you learn about these things in college and you oh, I want to do this someday, I just don't have the time or the money or the resources to do it right now. If we can find a way to keep them engaged until you do have the time and the money and the resources, I think that's going to be essential, because I think there is some fallout in between. So thinking about that, that's a great question. Yes, Ashley.
Interesting. So you talked a little bit about first, doing research on things, how we bring these messages,
How
social media.
Yeah, I think it definitely depends on who you're trying to connect with. There's a lot of research out of the Midwest on becoming a trusted messenger for ag producers, and they found that, predictably, ag journals are where people trust to get their information. So it's usually just who shares the same values and occupation as you. But I think there's room for, thinking about what those platforms are. I don't think there wasn't much research on individual platforms, but I do think young people, social media is a great way to connect with a younger audience. But whether or not that builds trust is another conversation. I think also community leaders of all kinds, there's research on, you don't necessarily have to feel like these community leaders have all the same values of you, but status does have a huge impact on whether or not you trust the information that's giving out. So even if you can partner with someone who, might be more moderate and not necessarily connect to this group's individual views, if they are established within the community and have a certain status, people of all kinds are more likely to trust what they have to say, for better or worse, moving forward. Yes, and firefighters, and yes, that's my great. I went home and told my parents that, because I think that's a great story of firefighters.
I was thinking about if anything was put in bilingual or translated, and so all this information.
Yeah.
In two languages.
So that's where Vail is just so inspiring. So they created they already had a climate action plan, and then they realized, okay, this is climate action for one segment of our population. We forgot to talk to anyone other than the people we always talk to, which tends to happen, unfortunately. So then they launched a climate equity plan, and their main goal was looking at how we can motivate and support our Hispanic community to take climate action. And they spent extensive resources, going to the ESL classes at the community college, and, just listening in, and then being public speakers within the classes, and then building trust within the college kids, and then the kids going home and talking to their parents. And it's hard because of immigration, especially like these days, and not everyone necessarily having legal status but they put in so many resources, and then did hundreds of surveys and focus groups. So yeah, I think partially is it all being translated, and then partially is gaining trust. I think it's even bigger.
It seems like framework communities have a real challenge in that
Yeah.
people are here for a short time
Yeah.
and they leave, or they could be second homes, and just think of all the things we saw. Place on the mountain.
That's
You know,
true.
people come in and they're all really crashed, or, however. It just seems different than that range communities.
Definitely.